Thomas Silverstein. For more than 35 years, this man lived in cells where the lights never fully went out, and no other prisoner was ever allowed within arm's reach of him. He earned that by stabbing a corrections officer to death in broad daylight, in front of other guards, while his own wrists were still locked in handcuffs. The isolation order that followed him for the rest of his life may have reshaped the entire American prison system, more than anything a warden ever designed on paper. He was born Thomas Conway in February of 1952, and he came into the federal system in 1977 on an armed robbery sentence, a crime he pulled off alongside his own father and his cousin. 15 years at Leavenworth was the price. It was inside Leavenworth that he joined the Aryan Brotherhood, and it was inside Leavenworth that the killing began. In 1980, he was convicted of murdering a fellow inmate named Danny Atwell, who had reportedly refused to move heroin through the prison. That conviction was later thrown out in 1985, after the jailhouse informants who testified against him were caught lying under oath. But by then it hardly mattered, because Silverstein had already become something far worse at a prison in southern Illinois called Marion. At Marion, he and another inmate, Clayton Fountain, killed a man named Robert Chappelle in 1981. Then they went hunting for Raymond Smith, the man everyone called Cadillac, the national leader of a rival group who had been trying to have Silverstein killed first. On September 27th of 1982, the two of them got to Smith with homemade blades and stabbed him 67 times. When he was dead, they dragged his body up and down the narrow walkway in front of the other cells, so every man on the row could see what they had done. By then, Silverstein had already taken at least 3 lives behind bars, and somehow it got worse. What made him a legend inside the federal system happened on October 22nd of 1983 at around 10:30 in the morning. He was being walked back from a shower, hands cuffed behind him, when he stopped at the cell of an inmate named Randy Gomez. Gomez had a homemade key. In the space of a few seconds, the cuffs were off. A sharpened shank was in Silverstein's hand, and Officer Merle Klutz was on the floor. The autopsy would later count 40 separate wounds. Silverstein shouted that this was between him and Klutz, and no one else. For months he had been convinced the officer was tormenting him, destroying his artwork, holding back his mail. An internal investigation found that none of it was true, but the truth never reached him, and it never changed a thing. He was handed another life sentence, and the judge who heard the case described him and Fountain as masters of prison murder. From that day forward, Silverstein lived under what the Bureau of Prisons called a no human contact order. First, it was a windowless cell beneath the prison in Atlanta, then back to Leavenworth, then the Supermax at ADX Florence beginning in 2005. During a riot at the Atlanta facility in 1987, Cuban detainees briefly pulled him out of his cell, only for him to be handed straight over to the FBI's hostage rescue team. He became the longest-held inmate in solitary confinement in the entire federal system, more than 35 unbroken years of it. He sued, arguing the isolation amounted to cruel and unusual punishment. He lost every time. In 2011, a judge ruled his conditions were not unusually extreme. And in 2014, a federal appeals court held that 30 years of solitary did not violate the Constitution. Silverstein once described the experience as the minutes and the hours and the years simply dripping away, with no end and no relief anywhere in sight. He died on May 11th of 2019 at 67 from complications after heart surgery. Today he is remembered as the single most important reason the modern American Supermax prison exists at all. But Silverstein did not act alone the day Marion bled. Hours after Klutz went down, the man who had helped him drag a body across that walkway was about to prove he could be even more dangerous on his own. Clayton Fountain. He killed his first man before he ever saw the inside of a federal prison. By the time he was finished, 5 people were dead, and the government had run out of ordinary ways to hold him. So they built him a cell of his own, sealed him inside it, and waited to see what would happen. What did happen is not the ending that anyone watching him expected. Clayton Fountain was born in September of 1955 at Fort Benning, Georgia, into a military family. He followed that family into the Marine Corps, and while he was stationed in the Philippines in 1974, he was disciplined by his staff sergeant. His response was to get hold of a smuggled weapon and kill the man. That earned him a life sentence, and the life sentence eventually delivered him to Marion, the prison the federal system reserved for the inmates no one else could control. Inside, he fell in with Thomas Silverstein, and the two of them became one of the deadliest pairings the system had ever housed. Together they killed Robert Chappelle. Together they killed Cadillac Smith. By the autumn of 1983, Fountain was responsible for 5 deaths across roughly a decade behind bars, a body count that started with a Marine sergeant on a base overseas and only grew once the walls closed in around him. And then came the same day that turned Silverstein into a legend. Hours after Silverstein killed Officer Klutz that morning, at around 8:30 that evening, Fountain ran the exact same play. He slipped his cuffs with a hidden key, broke away from the officers escorting him, got his hands on a knife, and attacked. Officer Robert Hoffman left a position of safety to help his fellow guards, and he was fatally stabbed for it. 2 other officers were seriously wounded, one of them disabled for the rest of his life. The detail that has haunted Marion ever since is that Hoffman died in the arms of his own son, who also worked at the prison. According to one guard's testimony, Fountain later remarked that it would have been fun to kill the son too. You'd think a mind like that would be impossible to look away from, and yet for decades almost no one tried to understand it. Part of his reasoning, by his own account, was almost childish in how simple it was. He did not want Silverstein to finish the day with more kills than he had. The federal system gave him a title after that: most dangerous prisoner in the country. It was not a label handed out lightly, and Fountain had earned every word of it. They moved him to the Federal Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri, and built him a cell unlike any other in the system, one where the only people he ever encountered were the small handful of staff authorized to come near him. For all practical purposes, he had been removed from the human race and stored away. And here is where the story turns into something almost no one saw coming. Inside that sealed cell, Fountain found religion. He converted to Catholicism and was baptized while still in shackles in April of 1992. He began taking college courses by mail and earned 2 degrees, an associate's in business and a bachelor's in philosophy and business from Ohio University. He struck up a quiet correspondence with an order of Trappist monks. The most dangerous prisoner in America spent his final years studying philosophy and writing letters to men who had given their lives to silence and prayer. He died of a heart attack on July 12th of 2004, at just 48 years old. After his death, the monastic community he had grown close to accepted him, posthumously, as a lay brother. His life later became the subject of a book about a murderer who somehow became a monk. Silverstein and Fountain were killers the system itself had created and then could not contain. The next man to land at Marion arrived already famous, dressed in a tailored suit, carrying a nickname the newspapers adored, and a reputation for walking away from every charge the government had ever thrown at him: John Gotti. For years, the press called him the Teflon Don, because no matter what the government accused him of, nothing ever seemed to stick. He beat 3 major cases in a row. He held court on the sidewalks of Manhattan in $2,000 suits, while federal agents watched and seethed. And then one of his own men sat down in a witness chair, and the suit came off for good. John Gotti became the boss of the Gambino crime family, the way bosses so often took power in that world, by removing the man sitting above him. On December 16th of 1985, Gotti orchestrated the murder of Paul Castellano outside Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan, where waiting gunmen shot the old boss dead on a crowded street at the height of the holiday season. With Castellano gone, Gotti stepped into the most powerful seat in the American mafia, and he made no effort whatsoever to hide it. He seemed to enjoy the cameras and the headlines, happy to be recognized on the street and treated like a celebrity rather than a criminal. Where other bosses lived in the shadows, Gotti lived under the lights, and for a few years it seemed to work for him. 3 separate times prosecutors brought him to trial, and 3 separate times he walked out a free man, though it later emerged that some of those victories had been built on tampered juries and witnesses too frightened to speak against him. The nickname grew out of those wins. The Teflon Don, the boss nothing could stick to. The streak finally ended when his own underboss, Salvatore Gravano, the man known as Sammy the Bull, agreed to turn and testify against him. For a sworn man at the top of that world to sit in a witness chair and lay out the inner workings of the family was almost unheard of. Everything Gotti had spent years protecting collapsed the moment Gravano opened his mouth. On April 2nd of 1992, the verdict came back. Guilty on 13 counts, among them 5 murders, along with racketeering, obstruction of justice, tax evasion, illegal gambling, extortion, and loan sharking. The judge, Leo Glasser, sentenced him to life without the possibility of parole and added a fine of $250,000. One federal official summed the whole thing up by saying the Teflon was finally gone and that this time every single charge had stuck to him like Velcro. Gotti was sent to Marion, and Marion did not care in the slightest who he had been on the outside. He spent his days in a cell roughly 8 by 7 feet, locked down some 22 to 23 hours every day, with a cot, a basin, a toilet, a radio, and a small black and white television. His meals arrived through a slot in the door. There was no work, no group recreation, no classes, nothing. The most feared crime boss in America was left alone with a food slot and a television set the size of a hardcover book. In July of 1996, that isolation cracked open for a single violent moment. In the recreation area, another inmate named Walter Johnson beat him bloody after Gotti used a racial slur. According to law enforcement, Gotti then put out word that he would pay the Aryan Brotherhood as much as $100,000 to have Johnson killed. And no, I'm not making that up. Prison officials stepped in and protected Johnson instead, and the man who once ran New York could not touch a single inmate inside those walls. In 1998, Gotti was diagnosed with throat cancer. He never recovered from it. He died on June 10th of 2002, at 61 years old, inside the Federal Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri, the same facility that had once held Clayton Fountain. The Dapper Don, the man the cameras had followed everywhere he went, died quietly in a prison hospital bed, far from the streets he once believed he owned. Gotti at least operated by a code of sorts, a logic to the blood he spilled, a hunger for power that made a grim kind of sense. The next man who passed through Marion killed for something far emptier than power. He killed people for nothing more than the color of their skin. Joseph Paul Franklin. He renamed himself after a founding father and a Nazi propagandist, and then he spent 3 years crossing the country, leaving bodies in his wake. He shot a magazine publisher and left him paralyzed for life. He shot a civil rights leader on a street in Indiana. By the time he was finished, the count of his victims may have climbed into the 20s, and he never expressed a flicker of regret for any of it. He was born James Vaughn in April of 1950 in Mobile, Alabama. As an adult, he threw that name away and built himself a new one to honor both Benjamin Franklin and the propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, a choice that told you almost everything you needed to know about the man he had decided to become. Between 1977 and 1980, he carried out a long string of murders across the country, an estimated 15 and possibly as many as 22 people, choosing his targets out of pure hatred. Black men, interracial couples, and Jewish victims. He moved constantly from state to state, struck from a distance whenever he could, and then vanished before anyone understood what had happened. He bankrolled the entire campaign by robbing banks along the way, turning himself into a one-man traveling war against everyone he had been taught to despise. His record reads like a grim tour of the era's violence. He firebombed a synagogue in Chattanooga. In March of 1978, he shot the hustler publisher Larry Flynt in Lawrenceville, Georgia, leaving him paralyzed for the rest of his life, reportedly in retaliation for a photo spread that had enraged him. In May of 1980, he shot and wounded the Urban League president Vernon Jordan in Fort Wayne, Indiana. He was acquitted of the Jordan shooting in 1982, and then, years later, he calmly confessed to it anyway, almost as if he wanted the credit for it. He was finally caught in 1980 after a worker at a blood bank recognized the distinctive tattoos covering his body and made a phone call. For a man who had eluded investigators across half the country, it was a strangely small thing that brought him down. The courts handed him multiple life sentences and eventually a sentence of death. His connection to Marion is short, and it is brutal. For a long stretch of his spree, investigators in different states had no idea they were chasing the same man, because the killings were scattered across the map, and there was rarely an obvious thread tying one to the next. By the time the full picture came together, the damage was already done. He was transferred to Marion on January 31st of 1982 to begin serving life. 3 days later, on February 3rd, a group of inmates set upon him and stabbed him 15 times in the neck and the abdomen. Against the odds, he survived all of it. 3 days inside the walls, 15 wounds, and he lived to see the inside of a cell again. He was later moved to death row in Missouri at the Potosi Correctional Center, where he spent his final years giving interviews and adding to the long list of crimes he was willing to claim, talking about the killings with a flatness that unsettled even the people who had hunted him. On November 20th of 2013, the state of Missouri executed him by lethal injection for the 1977 sniper killing of a man named Gerald Gordon, who was shot from a distance as he stood in a parking lot outside a synagogue near St. Louis. One of the most remarkable footnotes to his entire story came from Larry Flynt, the man Franklin had left in a wheelchair. Flynt publicly opposed the execution, arguing that the government had no business at all being in the business of killing people. The man Franklin had tried to murder spent some of his own breath fighting to keep Franklin alive, and lost that fight in the end. Franklin's war was a domestic one, fought with a rifle and a road map across American highways. The last man we will look at here dealt in a different kind of weapon entirely, the kind that arms whole armies, and his road map stretched clear across the globe. Victor Bout. They called him the Merchant of Death, and for once the nickname was not an exaggeration. He sold the weapons that fueled wars on multiple continents, and for years he stayed one step ahead of every government that wanted him in chains. In the end, it took a fake arms deal, a sting in a Bangkok hotel, and a basketball player half a world away to finally bring his story to a close. Viktor Bout was a Russian arms dealer and a former Soviet military translator, a man who turned the chaos of the post-Soviet world into a thriving global business, moving guns and ammunition to anyone who could pay his price. As the old empire fell apart, vast stockpiles of weapons were left behind, with no one watching them. And Bout understood better than almost anyone how to get those weapons from the warehouses where they sat into the hands of the people fighting wars in faraway places. For years, he operated in the gaps between borders and jurisdictions, slipping through the cracks no single country could close. And for years, no one managed to lay a hand on him. That changed in 2008. Agents with the American DEA built an elaborate undercover operation in Thailand, posing as buyers working for a Colombian guerrilla group. Bout agreed to sell them a massive arsenal, including anti-aircraft missiles capable of bringing down aircraft out of the sky. When the undercover agents told him plainly that the weapons would be used to kill American pilots, his reported answer was chilling in its simplicity. He told them they shared the same enemy. He was arrested in Thailand and, after a long legal fight, extradited to the United States in 2010. The extradition itself became a diplomatic struggle, with Russia pushing hard to keep him out of American hands and the United States pushing just as hard to bring him in. And for a while, it was not clear which side would win. In November of 2011, a federal court in Manhattan convicted him of conspiring to kill American citizens and officials, of agreeing to deliver those missiles, and of supporting a terrorist organization. The following year, he was sentenced to 25 years, the very minimum the law would allow. He served that time at Marion, settling into the routine of a high-security federal inmate while, on the outside, his name kept surfacing in conversations about prisoner exchanges and geopolitics. His release date was set for the summer of 2029. He might well have still been sitting in that cell today, if not for what unfolded on a tarmac in Abu Dhabi. On December 8th of 2022, Viktor Bout walked free in a one-for-one prisoner exchange. The person traded away to bring him home was the American basketball star Brittany Griner, who had been detained in Russia on a drug charge. One of the most notorious arms traffickers on the entire planet, set loose in a straight trade for a professional basketball player. The deal drew fierce criticism from people who could not understand how a man convicted of plotting to kill Americans could be handed back to a hostile government, but the trade went through all the same. Bout returned home to something close to a hero's welcome in Russia. He publicly backed the invasion of Ukraine, joined the nationalist Liberal Democratic Party, and in 2023 won a seat in the Regional Legislative Assembly of Ulyanovsk Oblast. The Merchant of Death traded his prison cell for a seat in his country's government, and a man the United States had spent years hunting and a decade caging was suddenly a free and respectable lawmaker, shaking hands and casting votes. For the agents who had spent so long building the case against him, watching him resurface in a government chamber was a hard thing to swallow. But Bout was far from the only man inside Marion's walls whose secrets reached across oceans and tangled into the affairs of entire nations. Some of the men who passed through those cells were not gangsters or street killers at all. They were trusted insiders who sold out their own country from the inside, quietly, a document at a time. And what they handed over did damage so deep it took the government decades to even finish measuring it. If you're liking this video and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. We drop new cases every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Jonathan Pollard. He is the only American ever handed a life sentence for spying on behalf of a friendly country, not an enemy. The man he betrayed his oath for was a close ally, and the secrets he carried out the door filled suitcases. The strangest part of his story is how it ended, with a prime minister waiting on a runway to welcome him home like a returning hero. Jonathan Pollard was a civilian intelligence analyst for the United States Navy, a man trusted with access to some of the most sensitive material the government produced. He had spent years building the kind of clearance that let him walk past locked doors most people never knew existed. In 1984 and 1985, he used that access to hand a staggering volume of classified documents to Israel. According to a later damage assessment by the CIA, he passed along roughly 1,500 messages from one highly classified intelligence summary alone, on top of more than 800 other compromised documents, all of it carried out of secure facilities and delivered to his handlers in suitcases. What made the case so explosive was not just the scale of it, but who it was for. Pollard was not selling secrets to the Soviet Union or to some sworn enemy of the country. He was passing them to an ally of the United States. To the people who prosecuted him, that distinction did nothing to soften the damage. Sensitive material was sensitive material, and once it walked out the door in a suitcase, there was no calling it back, no matter whose hands it eventually landed in. The intelligence community treated the breach as a catastrophe, arguing that secrets shared with one government had a way of reaching others. The walls began closing in on him in November of 1985. Sensing that he was under suspicion, Pollard and his wife drove to the Israeli embassy in Washington and begged for asylum. They were turned away at the gates. With nowhere left to run and no one willing to shelter him, he was arrested almost immediately afterward. His brief career as a spy finished in a matter of hours. He pleaded guilty as part of an agreement with prosecutors, the kind of deal that, on paper, should have spared him the harshest possible punishment. It did not. On March 4th of 1987, Judge Aubrey Robinson sentenced him to life in prison. The decision was shaped in part by a classified memorandum from the Secretary of Defense at the time, Caspar Weinberger, who laid out in secret just how much harm Pollard's leaks had truly caused. With that sentence, Pollard became, and remains, the only American ever given life for spying on behalf of an ally rather than an adversary. His defenders would spend the next 3 decades arguing that the punishment was wildly out of step with what he had actually done. He was first held at the Federal Prison Hospital in Springfield, then transferred to Marion in June of 1988, before being moved again to a facility in North Carolina in 1993. His case turned into a long-running source of tension between the United States and Israel, which lobbied for his release for years and raised his name in negotiation after negotiation. In 1995, Israel went so far as to grant him citizenship while he was still sitting in an American cell, turning a convicted spy into a national cause. He was finally paroled on November 20th of 2015, after 30 years inside. For another 5 years, the terms of that parole kept him tethered, restricting where he could go and what he could do. When those restrictions expired in November of 2020, the last door swung open. On December 30th of that year, Pollard boarded a flight and moved to Israel, where the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, was waiting at the airport to greet him in person. The man the United States had locked away for life walked off a plane and straight into a hero's welcome in the country he had betrayed his own for. Pollard handed his secrets to a friend. The next man inside Marion's walls handed his to the enemy, and he kept right on doing it for the better part of 2 decades, dragging his own family into the betrayal alongside him. John Anthony Walker. For 18 years, a United States Navy officer carried encrypted military secrets straight to the Soviet Union, and almost no one noticed. He did not do it alone. He pulled in his brother, his best friend, and eventually his own son. By the time it all came apart, the Soviets had been quietly reading more than 1 million of America's secret naval messages. John Anthony Walker was a chief warrant officer and communications specialist in the United States Navy, a man whose job handed him the keys to the codes that protected the country's military communications. In 1967, he made the decision that would do extraordinary damage. He walked into the Soviet embassy and offered to sell what he knew. There was no ideology behind it, no grand cause. For Walker, it was about the money, plain and simple, and the Soviets were happy to pay. What followed was not a single act of betrayal in a moment of weakness. It was a business, and it ran for nearly 2 decades. Walker sold cipher material that let Soviet intelligence read encrypted American naval traffic. And as the operation grew, he recruited others to keep the pipeline flowing long after his own access began to fade. He brought in his brother, Arthur, and a close friend named Jerry Whitworth, a fellow Navy man with access of his own. In time, he even pulled in his own son, Michael. Over the years, the ring helped the Soviets decipher more than 1 million encrypted naval messages. More than 1 million. That's not a typo, by the way. It is hard to overstate what that kind of access meant during the Cold War. The codes Walker compromised protected the movements of ships, the positions of submarines, the war plans of a navy operating at the tense heart of a global standoff. For 18 years, a foreign adversary had a clear window into all of it. And the man holding that window open was wearing an American uniform and collecting a paycheck for the privilege. Intelligence officials would later say that in a real war, the edge Walker handed Moscow could have been catastrophic, costing the country ships, submarines, and the men aboard them. By the time it was finally over, counterintelligence officials would rank what Walker built among the most damaging spy operations in the nation's history. Part of what made it so unsettling was how ordinary the man at the center of it looked. Walker was not some shadowy figure in a trench coat, passing notes in the dark. He was a Navy veteran, a working private investigator, a father raising a family. And for 18 years, he quietly handed the keys to the kingdom to America's chief adversary, while living an unremarkable life in plain sight, attracting almost no suspicion at all. The ring did not come undone through some brilliant stroke of counterintelligence. It came undone because of his own family. Walker's ex-wife, Barbara, finally went to the FBI and told agents exactly what her former husband had been doing all those years. On May 20th of 1985, the long-running operation collapsed when Walker was placed under arrest. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Walker did what so many of these men do when the end arrives. He cut a deal. He agreed to plead guilty and to testify against his friend Whitworth, and in exchange, prosecutors agreed to go easier on his son, Michael, who had been drawn into his father's web while still a young man. Even at the very end, Walker was trading information for advantage, only this time the currency was his own family. In 1986, he was sentenced to 2 life terms. He became one of the most notorious inmates ever held at Marion, a man whose quiet, patient treason had arguably done more damage than any battlefield defeat. He spent his remaining years behind bars as his health slowly gave out. He died on August 28th of 2014 at 77 years old at a federal facility in North Carolina, suffering from both cancer and diabetes. He passed away just months before he would have become eligible for parole, the freedom he had chased his whole life slipping away within sight of the finish. Walker spied for money, coldly and methodically, for 18 long years. The next man came to it younger, angrier, and far more reckless, and once the law finally caught up with him, he refused to simply sit quietly in his cell and serve his time. Christopher Boyce. He was a young man with a top-secret clearance and a head full of disillusionment when he began feeding American satellite secrets to the Soviet Union. But betraying his country turned out to be only the opening chapter. Because once he was behind bars, Christopher Boyce did something almost no one ever manages. He broke out, and then he went on a bank-robbing spree across the American West. Boyce earned the nickname the Falcon, and his partner in espionage, a drug dealer named Andrew Dalton Lee, was known as the Snowman. Boyce worked inside a classified communications room at the defense contractor TRW, a place secure enough that the people who worked there called it the Black Vault. It was the kind of room where the country's satellite and cipher secrets passed through every day, and somehow a young clerk had been handed a seat inside it. From within that vault, he funneled those secrets out to the Soviets, handing the material to Lee, who carried it down to the Soviet embassy in Mexico City and came back with cash. What made it so strange was who Boyce actually was. He was not a hardened operative or a career criminal when it started. He was a young man, barely out of his teens, who had landed a sensitive government job and then, by his own later telling, grown bitter and disillusioned with the things he watched passing across his desk. That bitterness curdled into betrayal, and a clerk with a security badge quietly became one of the more damaging spies of his era, all before he was really old enough to understand what he had set in motion. The scheme fell apart in January of 1977 when Boyce was arrested. Later that year, he was convicted of espionage and sentenced to 40 years in prison. For most men, a sentence like that would have been the end of the story, the slow beginning of decades spent waiting for the calendar to run out. For Boyce, it was barely an intermission. On January 21st of 1980, he escaped from the federal prison at Lompoc and disappeared. And he did not lie low and wait to be forgotten. While he was on the run, he reinvented himself as a bank robber, holding up an astonishing 17 banks across the West before the law finally ran him to ground. You'd think a fugitive that busy would be caught within a week. For 19 months, nobody could lay a hand on him. He was finally recaptured in 1981, and only then did the full strangeness of his story really begin. Even back in custody, Boyce was not finished making noise. He gave an interview to Australian television in which he made explosive claims about the activities of the CIA, including allegations tied to the dramatic removal of Australia's own Prime Minister back in 1975. Not long afterward, he was attacked by fellow inmates, an assault he was convinced the guards themselves had quietly arranged to silence him. He was transferred to Marion and held in isolation, sealed away from the rest of the population. Then his story took a genuinely unexpected turn. In April of 1985, the same man who had sold his country's secrets sat down in front of a United States Senate subcommittee and testified about how to stop insider spies like himself, explaining from first-hand experience how a trusted employee could betray a nation and what might be done to catch the next one sooner. It was a remarkable reversal. The traitor turned into a witness for the very system he had wronged. His cooperation earned him allies among the senators, and with their backing, he was moved out of solitary confinement in 1988 and sent to a prison in Minnesota. Christopher Boyce was paroled on September 16th of 2002, after roughly 25 years behind bars. His strange, twisting life of espionage, escape, robbery, and a peculiar kind of redemption was later dramatized in the film The Falcon and the Snowman, which carried his story to an audience that found it almost too wild to be true. Boyce and the other spies dealt in secrets and silence and stolen paper. The next man who landed at Marion dealt in something far bloodier, ruling a city's underworld through raw fear and presiding over one of the deadliest stretches in American mob history. Nicodemo Scarfo. They called him Little Nicky, a small man with an enormous appetite for violence. For nearly a decade, he ruled the Philadelphia underworld, and the bodies piled up so quickly that even hardened investigators struggled to keep an accurate count. But the cruelest blow in his entire story did not fall on a rival or an enemy. It fell on his own family, in the middle of a courtroom. Nicodemo Scarfo took control of the Philadelphia and South Jersey crime family in 1981 and held that power until 1990, steering the organization through what many consider the bloodiest era in its history. Where some bosses worked to keep an uneasy peace and avoid drawing the attention of the law, Scarfo seemed to thrive on the opposite. He settled disputes the simplest way he knew how, and under his rule, killing became a tool he reached for easily and often. The fear he inspired was the whole point, the thing that held his crumbling organization together even as it tore itself apart. But that same hunger for violence was also the thing that doomed him. Every killing left behind grieving families, frightened associates, and potential witnesses, and the more bodies that piled up, the more pressure built inside his own organization. Men who feared they might be next began quietly looking for a way out, and an exit ramp was exactly what federal prosecutors were offering. Scarfo's brutality had held his world together for a while, but in the end, it was the very thing that pried it open, turning the people who knew his secrets into the witnesses who would bury him. Between 1987 and 1989, the law came for him in waves. He was convicted across 3 separate cases on charges ranging from conspiracy to racketeering to first-degree murder, and the sentences stacked up one on top of the other. 14 years, then 55 years, and then a life term that would later be overturned on appeal. The centerpiece was a federal racketeering trial in 1988, which found him guilty of ordering 9 murders and 4 attempted murders, on top of extortion, gambling, loan sharking, and drug dealing. The prosecutors who finally put him away described him as a remorseless and profoundly evil man, and the record they built against him made the description hard to argue with. As with so many of these stories, the empire was brought down from the inside. Scarfo's own nephew and underboss, Philip Leonetti, turned against him and became a government witness, calmly laying bare the inner workings of the family he had been born into. A man who had once stood at Scarfo's right hand walked into court and dismantled him, piece by piece, from the witness stand. And Leonetti was not the only one. The Scarfo era produced an unusual number of turncoats, men so frightened of their own boss that cooperating with the government came to feel safer than staying loyal to him. One by one, they walked into courtrooms and helped the law assemble the case that would finally end his reign. But the moment that revealed the true human cost of Scarfo's world came during that same 1988 trial. His son, just 17 years old, attempted to take his own life. The boy never regained consciousness, and he lingered in that state for years before he died in 2014. Whatever empire Scarfo thought he had built, this was the wreckage it left behind, inside his own home, where the violence he traded in finally reached the one place he could not wall off from the world. Scarfo was sent to Marion in 1989, and he would never walk free again. He died on January 13th of 2017 at 87 years old at a federal medical facility in North Carolina, reportedly of cancer, still serving the 55-year sentence that had outlasted the life term the courts took away. Scarfo ran his empire with brutal, open violence, and in the end, it consumed even the people closest to him. The last man on this list ruled his own corner of the underworld, with a savagery that unsettled even other criminals, in a neighborhood whose name has since passed into legend. Jimmy Coonan. In the heart of Manhattan, in a neighborhood called Hell's Kitchen, there was once a gang so vicious that even the mafia kept its distance. Their leader seized power by having a rival assassinated, and his crew became infamous for what they did to their victims after the killing was done. His name was Jimmy Coonan, and of all 10 men in this story, he is the only one still sitting behind bars today. James Coonan led the Westies, the Irish-American gang that ruled Hell's Kitchen from roughly 1977 to 1988. He came to power the way so many in that world did, through blood. His rival, a gangster named Mickey Spillane, was assassinated in 1977, a hit reportedly carried out as a favor by a feared Gambino family killer named Roy DeMeo. Part of what drove Coonan was deeply personal. Years earlier, Spillane had kidnapped and beaten his father, and Coonan had never let it go. Taking the neighborhood was both business and revenge. Once he was in control, Coonan and his crew built a reputation that unsettled even other hardened criminals. The Westies became known for dismembering the bodies of the people they killed, a practice grim enough that the gang's name alone carried a chill across the New York underworld. It was a level of savagery that made even the established mafia families wary of them, and for a time, the bigger organizations found it easier to do business with the Westies than to cross them. And somehow, that brutality was not even the thing that finally brought them down. For all their savagery, the Westies did not operate in a vacuum. As Coonan's power grew, the gang fell into an uneasy working arrangement with the larger Italian mafia families, who found it more profitable to rent the Irish crew's reputation for terror than to go to war with it. The Westies became, in effect, a kind of subcontractor for violence in a city already crowded with it. But that arrangement only raised their profile, and a higher profile meant more attention from exactly the people whose job it was to take gangs like theirs apart. The gang unraveled because of one of their own. Coonan's enforcer, Mickey Featherstone, was framed for a murder by other members of the Westies, set up by the same crew he had given his loyalty to. Feeling betrayed by the very people he had bled for, Featherstone flipped and became an informant, and once he started talking, he knew exactly where every body was buried. His cooperation cracked the whole operation open for a young, ambitious federal prosecutor named Rudolph Giuliani, who built a sweeping racketeering case against the gang. It became one of the early, defining uses of the racketeering laws that prosecutors would later wield against organized crime all across the country. Rather than chasing each murder one at a time, the government treated the entire gang as a single criminal enterprise, and that approach left Coonan with nowhere to hide behind the chaos of the streets. In 1988, Coonan was convicted of racketeering, with the criminal enterprise tied to 8 or more murders. The judge sentenced him to 75 years in prison and a fine of $1 million, and recommended that he never be granted parole. He was shipped off to Marion to begin serving a sentence designed to outlast him. Coonan is still incarcerated to this day. Now in his late 70s, he has spent roughly 37 years behind bars, watching the world he once terrorized fade into history. The Hell's Kitchen he ruled barely resembles itself anymore, redeveloped and gentrified into something its old residents would hardly recognize, its violent past paved over by decades of change. In July of 2025, a federal appeals court rejected his latest bid to have that sentence reduced. His mandatory release date sits on the calendar for June 1st of 2030, the only one of these 10 men with a date still waiting ahead of him rather than already behind. 10 men passed through the same set of walls in southern Illinois, and the prison built to contain them ended up reshaping the entire federal system. Most of them are gone now, A handful walked free, and only one is still inside, counting down to a release date years away. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.